Everyone, we'll just give it another minute here for attendees to join. Okay, I think we can get underway here, folks. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by the Canadian Hydrogen Fuel Cell Association and Guidehouse. In this webinar, we'll be discussing how lessons learned from projects abroad can accelerate commercialization of the Canadian hydrogen market and demonstrate Canada's competitiveness compared to other jurisdictions. My name is Nicholas Hilario, Director of Operations here at the CHFCA, and I'm speaking to you today from Surrey, British Columbia, the traditional ancestral unceded territory of the Semiahmoo, Katsi, Coquitlam, Kwantlen, Kikite, and Tsawwassen First Nations. For those of you who are not familiar with the CHFCA yet, the CHFCA is the National Industry and Research Association that supports the hydrogen sector here in Canada. We were established in 2009, and we have provincial affiliates in British Columbia, Alberta, and Ontario. Our primary mandate is to be the voice of the sector and support the ecosystem with advocacy, government relations, communications, and networking. We have 200 members nationwide who work on everything from fuel cell stack development to hydrogen production, vehicles, testing and engineering, and research as well. And for those of you who are interested in joining us as a member, please do reach out to me after this webinar, and I'd be happy to discuss further. Just some housekeeping rules before I hand it over to our guest presenters here at Guidehouse. Please note that this webinar will be recorded and held in accordance with the CHFCA's competition law compliance policy. That being said, we kindly request all participants to refrain from discussing any confidential business information, such as pricing. Please be sure to keep your microphones on mute and feel free to enter your questions for our presenters here in the chat section on Teams. And if we don't get to your questions during the Q&A segment today, we will be sure to follow up with you by email. Now, without further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our guest presenters from Guidehouse for today's webinar: Imran Abdulla, Associate Director, Mark Eisenhower, Director, and David D. Francesco Marino, Senior Consultant. Imran, Mark, and David, the floor is yours.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Nicholas. I think I can kick it off with some introductions. So David D. Francesco Marino, a senior consultant with Guidehouse based in our Toronto location. Also the resident Canadian on this call out of us three gentlemen. I work with energy providers in the EU and the US, and mainly Canada, on decarbonization strategy, excuse me, and clean fuels implementation, including hydrogen. Recently, I've supported the DOE Hydrogen Hub applications with a group of companies in the US, and have been supporting the 5,000 vehicle challenge with Edmonton Global, as of most recently in Canada. So I can kick it off to Mark to give an introduction, and Imran to take it from there.
Sure. Thank you, David. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on your time zone. Mark Eisenhower. I am part of our decarbonization solutions team here at Guidehouse, working very closely with David and Imran on a day-to-day basis. My personal background, I've spent the majority of my career in and around the natural gas value chain, both in North America as well as internationally. Since joining Guidehouse 4 years ago, have been almost exclusively focused on thinking through measures to decarbonize that value chain and how we grow that value chain in the future. So those things include hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, renewable natural gas, to name a few. And we're very pleased to be here today and share this time with you, and look forward to, quite frankly, the Q&A is the fun part for us. So the quicker we get there, the more fun we'll have. So thank you for having us. Imran?
Nice one, Monk. Yes, I'm absolutely going to say good evening as I sit here in the United Kingdom, and it is very much moving towards dinner time where I am. So Imran Abdulla, Associate Director here at Guidehouse, like Mark and David said, work very closely in the hydrogen, CCS and low carbon technologies fuels area. Background, chemical engineer by trade. Spent a lot of my years in the gas industry at National Grid here in the UK. Was part of the original teams that really kicked off the hydrogen story, vision, and now moving towards implementation here in the UK. My remit is very much Europe and the Middle East, but of course I tend to have a lot of fun with Mark and David on projects. So I do dabble in North America when I can, because there's some really cool stuff happening here. So yeah, great to meet you all.
Awesome. So I can share our presentation, and Imran, you can carry on with us. Okay, can people see the screen?
We can see it, David.
Perfect. Okay, this is just a brief overview of short agenda for what we have planned today. I'm going to do a quick introduction to Guidehouse, talk about some of our work in Europe as it relates to the European hydrogen backbone, which Imran has been quite involved in. Then we'll discuss an initiative in the US called the Hydrogen Development Accelerator that is looking at overcoming barriers to permitting. And then we'll finish off with a discussion of the Canadian hydrogen landscape. And the theme of this webinar is really all about lessons learned from these international markets and how we can apply them in Canada and really grow the hydrogen market here. Imran, I hand it over to you to give an introduction to Guidehouse.
Awesome. Yeah. So Guidehouse itself is a global consultancy. I'm sure many of you have worked and collaborated with us on multiple different projects. In terms of the energy transition, we do a huge amount of work, stemming all the way from sustainability to finance support, to work in the public area spaces. And specifically, the team that you're hearing from today is very much focused on low carbon technologies such as hydrogen, CCS, RNG. Our area at present is, and as many of you know, is all about how do you stand up this market? How do you commercialize it? How do you really get control of that early stage commercial development of projects? And how do you really build consortia, bring projects together across the value chain to really make and stand up these projects and really create viable, strong techno-economic business cases? So what we'll kind of walk you through today is very much the lessons learned that we got from Europe, who, although may have started earlier, I think that US, Canada, and North America is really picking up pace in catching up, and will really take you on that journey of that story. So there's hopefully some really good nuggets and learnings you can take away at the end of this webinar. Okay, so again, as I said, early stage project commercialization is a key challenge that a lot of people are facing across North America and EU. So I'll kind of start this slide from the right and then move to the left. So we began in Europe an initiative called the European Hydrogen Backbone. I'll go into a lot more depth as we walk through the slides, but it's all about bringing TSOs and players together, creating a vision, evidence-backed, as unbiased as possible, that was really about stimulating the market and driving action and behavior to support government decision-making. And now Guidehouse is doing a lot of work supporting DOE hydrogen hubs. I know the first emissions just went through, and hopefully the list will be coming out very soon and shortly. And again, Guidehouse is playing a key role moving towards the implementation element of those grant submissions and the US Hydrogen Consortium. So myself, David, were a key part of that some time ago. Again, it was all about bringing players from the value chain together, stand up strong, viable business cases that were evidence-based. So quick summary there, but hopefully it sets the tone for what's coming next, which again is all about bringing players together and creating viable projects. Okay, so the European Hydrogen Backbone. So quick introduction. It started off as a very small initiative, no more than 5-6 TSOs, and has now grown to as strong as 30 plus in terms of the transmission system operators across Europe who are part of this initiative. The idea was quite straightforward at the beginning in terms of, hey, we need to set a vision. All of us collaborating together, creating a single unified voice is much more powerful than creating different visionary views and then trying to bring them all together. I think we realized very quickly in Europe that coming together regionally is much more powerful in both creating a narrative and strengthening the business case for hydrogen in Europe. So that's essentially what the EHB mission is that you see in the box on the right. It's all about fostering cross-border collaboration and ultimately supporting both the EU Commission and internal regional governments to make decisions that are right for stimulating the hydrogen market. Ultimately, that's what the EHB is. So let's jump to the next slide, David. So how did we go about building this? So what Guidehouse essentially led was, and what all the TSOs agreed, was any conclusion that was coming out of the EHB had to be as evidence-based as possible. So we created as much data to back up any statements we were making in any of the reports. So how did we actually go about doing that? Very structured. Ultimately, we knew demand was the key driver of where locations could potentially be for hydrogen. So the question that was first in our mind was, what is the most likely first movers in the demand side in Europe? What became very clear through stakeholder engagement was industrial clusters. Where you had strong industry that was deeply hard to abate or electrify, essentially set anchor points across Europe of where demand could be. Germany was a huge driver. Other areas in Central Europe were also huge, of highlighting, hey, we've got real demand sinks here that need hydrogen to support their transition to net zero. Then the next layer comes, which is, hey, we've got these demand sinks. Where's the supply most likely to come? Ultimately, in Europe, the first narrative was heavily driven by green hydrogen, wind, solar, offshore and onshore wind, especially. That gave that next layer of mapping of where green hydrogen could potentially be produced. Now, of course, it's evolved quite significantly, and there's loads of different colors that are coming into the narrative. Blue also, in terms of the role that natural gas could play in producing hydrogen. But you had quite a simple step. It was industrial clusters, they're your anchors. Where's the supply going to come? Then it's the cost competitiveness piece. How far away is supply from demand? How cheap can supply be made? What challenges does demand face in actually transitioning their infrastructure to be hydrogen ready, etc. And that was the third layer. That's when you create the economic basis that created the evidence to say, hang on a minute, this is actually a very viable, cost-effective means, relative, of course, for decarbonizing some of the most difficult sectors to abate that add huge GDP and jobs to each of the different markets. So that's essentially the approach that was taken for the HB. Now, what did we actually find? Huge regional differences. You had locations where demand was absolutely huge. We got all your existing industrial centers, Germany being the prime, and areas where demand was low because they don't currently have huge amounts of industry, but their ability to create cheap green hydrogen was really high. What that does is make it absolutely clear that there's a narrative here that the ability to connect these through a hydrogen backbone, a hydrogen network, and strong cross-border collaboration would be the balancing act between where supply is and where demand is, and bringing them all together. It was proof that by taking an evidence-based approach, you can clearly articulate the need for infrastructure and collaboration across the whole value chain and importantly, between markets and regions. That's essentially what came out from the analysis. Okay, let's jump to the next slide. So where are we at now? Evidence-based done, story and narrative clear, and clear need for infrastructure. Where the EHB has now evolved is moving to early stage project development. And to do that is critical then to almost create, hey, which consortia of players and partners need to come together to help essentially build what we call corridors in Europe. So there's some very clear routes from areas of supply to key areas of demand. So that's what you can kind of see with corridor A, B, C, D, and E. How the EHB has now evolved is to move these groups forward in terms of driving their individual stories. What's their supply and demand picture? Taking that next step deeper into where the demand is and how cost competitive supply is. Now, why this has been hugely beneficial is because it has created a means for narrative engagement with the European Commission, who are now actually creating funding mechanisms that directly align to these corridors, which of course is what it's all about. Your funding, your government decision-making, and your policy framework that's being created is being built around deep evidence-based and backed routes that all started from clear demand and supply pictures that were created. Let's jump to the next slide, David. So ultimately, this is where we're at now. The EHB initiative and its members are setting out an absolute clear plan for delivery that's ultimately supporting government decision-making. The hydrogen challenge is deeply complicated with a lot of news and stories. And to cut through that is all about creating evidence-based and having a very clear logical approach and taking government on that journey. That's essentially what's happened with the European Hydrogen Backbone and is now happening in terms of actual funding support to bring these corridors to life and essentially kickstart the market. So yeah, hopefully that was a very good a good introduction, and then when we hit the Q&A, we can go a lot deeper on some of the questions that I'm sure you're all wanting to ask. Let me hand over to Mark now, who's going to see how that can apply to North America and the concept that we're doing there.
Great. Thank you, Imran. So that's, I think, a really good backdrop to the discussion we're about to have. So I know many of the companies that are participating in the call today have been tracking, following, and perhaps many of you are involved in the hydrogen hub pursuit in the lower 48. So what's the rumors on the street? We anticipate that DOE will make their awards by the end of the month. In other words, they're going to pick those 8 to 10 special projects that get the grant support to activate development of those hubs and move this ecosystem development in the U.S. along. So I think the experience of the folks on this call are probably very similar to what we've seen in the U.S., right? The markets generally starts with bilateral projects between two entities, right? And that's kind of how the hub started, right? Where the companies that came together to participate in the DOE process were generally a mix of bilateral projects that came together to form the hub and do the applications this spring, and then go through the process that's been underway for the summer and the early fall. One of the key questions that started to come back, so the way that the process worked, if you're not familiar with it, is that DOE, after they reviewed the applications, they sent each of the parties a series of questions. And one of the consistent themes in those questions was, you need to tell us more about how you're connecting those projects within your hub, right? Because DOE recognizes, right, that if you have the broader ecosystem that has the liquidity and the transparency and the ability for more players to interact with each other, you are de-risking the entire investment, right? You're attracting more capital, you're attracting more players. It is the right way to develop the ecosystem. So got a lot of good feedback over the summer in that process. Each of the hubs were asked to provide a lot more detailed information to DOE about how they're interconnecting the projects within the particular hubs. So the next step in the process is that as the summer kind of unwound, we started to get a lot of good feedback, in particular from DOE, but really from the federal government. We want to start thinking about the next step, which is how do you then connect the hubs, right? Because now we've got a very robust, wholesome ecosystem that will drive down the cost and has a better probability of achieving the goals that have been set out in the legislation and the goals that the federal government has for the DOE program. Guidehouse, together with our partner RMI, have put forward a project to begin the process essentially that Imran just outlined, right? How do we think about those corridors, right? Where should that backbone be built out? Yeah, David, you can go. You can probably go to the next slide here. Thank you. So you can see where, you know, the process we're going to follow is very, very similar to what Imran outlined. There's been a lot of benefits from that, both with internal and external stakeholders. But we know, right, that the right thing to do once these hubs make progress is to figure out that interconnective tissue. We've done enough analysis both at Guidehouse as well as many of our peers and public studies. The most effective and efficient way to move hydrogen is via pipeline, right? So if we can connect the hubs via a transmission system, that's what we want to do. So we've got an initiative underway to start to flush this out in cooperation both with DOE, other federal agencies, and then ultimately it all comes back to the theme that we've talked about at the outset. How do we make this commercial? Right? How does this make economic sense? How are we going to do this? So that's the journey that we're on with the North American hydrogen backbone. We launched this initiative about a month ago, and we're in the process of establishing relationships with the key sponsors who will drive the project and process. So as we think about the broader ecosystem, another initiative that we have underway at Guidehouse is to think through more of what we call the state and local issues. There's a lot of good work being done by our peers, many other trade associations like the one that we have the opportunity to chat with you guys today, doing really good work on the federal level, some of those broader ecosystem issues. But at the end of the day, the majority of our clients see themselves as long-term players in the hydrogen ecosystem in more than one service territory. So if you're thinking about building infrastructure and the challenges associated with that, what we're trying to do with this initiative, what we call the Hydrogen Development Accelerator, is advocate for the clients to have homogeneous permitting and regulatory processes on a state and local basis. So as you build projects, design projects, and implement projects, you're not recreating the wheel in each and every jurisdiction that you're having to participate in. Maybe David, let's move to the next slide, please. So really what we're trying to do is think through, you know, how do we mitigate the risks that are associated with project development? Those include, you know, how we're managing the timeline. All of the incentive systems have very fixed timelines in order to earn credits, put things into commercial operation. How we attract the capital markets and ensure that by having this connective tissue and by having the ability to expedite development and implementation in the markets, we're de-risking the value chain, which makes it a better place for capital to find a home. We know that a system that has this interconnective tissue and has the ability to build out locally will help the market integrate and speed the process for really overcoming the barriers working with external stakeholders. This is a collaborative process, but we want to make it efficient, and we want to try to achieve not only the environmental objectives, but also push down the cost point so all members of the community can benefit from the program. Next slide, please. So the process that we've talked about is very similar to the work that we've done in the hydrogen hubs. It's very similar work that we've done with the midstream community in the EU. So when you hear Imran talk TSOs, that's what he's talking about. He's talking about the midstream community, where we want to do a strategic assessment of where we are today, understand what that future state looks like, and create the framework to implement these uniform codes and procedures and regulatory processes throughout the ecosystem. We are confident that that will help scale the market. It'll attract the capital markets, it'll reduce costs, and it'll make us be more successful in implementing hydrogen in the market segments where it's most beneficial. So that's a little bit about the Hydrogen Development Accelerator. And again, as Imran said, we look forward to the Q&A session. David, back to you.
Thanks a lot, Mark. Thanks, Imran. Yeah, I'll try to get to that Q&A session quickly. Hopefully I don't ramble on for too long. So I'll talk about the Canadian vision, Guidehouse's vision for Canadian hub, and really how the market can grow. So it's a lot of the stuff that Mark mentioned, but before I talk about the Canadian vision, I will address the hub concept in general and why we think it's applicable to Canada, and why it's beneficial. So really what the hydrogen hub funding in the US did was bring clarity to the sector from a planning and economic kind of viability side. So similar to what Europe is working on now with the delegated acts, that's based on the regulation for hydrogen, but the hydrogen hubs were really, you could say, like a North Star or some sort of clarity for project developers and investors. So we do think it's helpful framing that the criteria of that application was so detailed and gives us some good direction. So what is really a hub at its core? I mean, it's the co-location of supply and demand with an effort to minimize and efficiently utilize the conveyance. So that obviously that brings and bridges nicely to the EHB concept, which was really figuring out the most efficient means of transporting the hydrogen and between supply and demand. So yeah, it's really also a scalable ecosystem that can bring the cost of production down and enable other end uses and applications for hydrogen to be competitive with the current incumbent applications. So that kind of creates, having all those elements, the supply, the demand, the conveyance, bringing the price down, this virtual cycle of supply and demand, which grows and helps the sector and a region decarbonize. So another thing, we also prefer the word ecosystem over hub, so I'll probably use them interchangeably. A hub is not super descriptive, but ecosystem, I feel like, more describes what's happening in one of these regions when we talk about hydrogen. So why do we care about a hub in Canada? It's these reasons on the left-hand side. Really, there's a lack of standards, there's a lack of regulatory and regulatory clarity, incentives for hydrogen at the moment. Of course, they're picking up in the US, but less so in Canada. Lack of investor confidence. So the market liquidity that Mark mentioned is really not there at the moment. Of course, it's just we're starting, and this is not a market like gas or oil at the moment. Limited hydrogen demand, so less demand for hydrogen in the early years, which is as expected. The price of hydrogen is still high. And none of this is super new, but this is the approach that has been working in the US to create progress in growing the hydrogen market. So this is a provincial focus looking at Alberta. Guidehouse has done a pretty extensive view across the entire Canadian landscape, looking at each province and looking at business cases and really trying to find and tease out the elements that make a ideal hydrogen hub and that support a regional ecosystem for hydrogen. So this is focusing on Alberta here. A lot of this stuff, you guys are familiar with. It's an existing hydrogen demand. There's opportunity for new demand. from mobility, from industrial heat, from power and export. The other key thing is that, a lot of these end use sectors are actually being primed, or you could say the learning curve is being primed with real projects, mostly projects of pilot scale, and also mostly project announcements. But there definitely is progress in creating an ecosystem in Alberta and other places in Canada as well. So this is kind of starting to get to that idea of a hub. You can see that these industrial clusters are present in the province, and it's similar to Europe, where we had those industrial centers of demand. It's possible to then also connect them and really scale up the market in general. So these are the fun slides here. More fun on the left-hand side, just a bunch of writing on the right, which is super detailed. Feel free to review it afterwards. We'll probably send out this deck. Not going to go through everything in super high detail, but just speaking to the vision for how the hub can roll out between 2030 and 2040. So in 2030, you can think of this between now and 2030, really local clusters are forming. So it's this type of hub and spoke approach, where the hub is really forming in places like Edmonton, places like Calgary, Medicine Hat, where there's existing usage and production of hydrogen, and also this in tandem kind of carbon management network that already exists to some degree. We have the carbon trunk line in Edmonton, and plans in the province to expand that. So that's super relevant for hydrogen, because blue hydrogen will be the predominant form of hydrogen supply, or clean hydrogen supply in Alberta, at least in the first couple of decades. So this CO2 network of pipelines actually becomes developed between large emitters and places where you can sequester carbon. Also, fueling stations are starting to appear in small hubs. So you can see this icon here, fueling stations between the major cities that can first support a local network of back-to-base refueling hydrogen vehicles. And then, as we'll see, progressing and throughout the years to create more of a widespread network. So this is a 2040 view. So the hubs start to interconnect. It's these blue lines here, it's hydrogen pipelines, starting to connect different end uses of hydrogen. The price of hydrogen, clean hydrogen, is coming down. So really enabling a lot more hydrogen demand. And so that virtuous cycle then starts to kick off. We have also more connection of large emitters to the CO2 backbone that starts to form. And then similarly, the transportation network is expanding as well. 2050. So this is a view of what we like to call a fully liquid market. If that really is the goal, excluding all of these minor details, and this is all assumptions, of course, looking this far into the future. This is where we need to get, right? It's connection of hydrogen production, widespread hydrogen production, widespread hydrogen consumption. And that's really what gets you to a market that you have optionality for supply, security of supply, which is the vision for hydrogen in Canada. So that's the basic approach and the basic vision. The logical kind of next step, I've described by Mark and by Imran. But I think that's the last slide we have for that. More moving into closeout now. So these slides we'll send out and people can review, but happy to take any questions. I think I'll just move through these final two slides here too. We have a little bit more time. So just speaking about Guidehouse. So Guidehouse is, expert project commercialization and project managers. We spoke about some of our projects today, some of our leadership in the space. This is just a look at some project management expertise. Grant management is also a significant part of our business. The hydrogen hubs is a good example of that in the U.S. and trying to bring a lot of this expertise to Canada and really stand up a coalition of the willing, as we like to call it. Consortium is sort of becoming a played out word, as most of you probably believe. So that's our presentation for today. Thank you everyone for joining. Thanks to the CHFCA, Yvette, the whole team that gave us the opportunity today, and super happy to take questions from you at this point.
Thank you, Imran, Mark, and David. And now we invite our members and attendees on the line here to enter your questions in the chat section on Teams, or feel free to raise your virtual hand, and we'll just call you. Perhaps just to get things started, a question from the CHFCA for Imran. Imran, we're just curious, what are some hydrogen-related trends emerging in Europe that may affect Canadian industry or policy in the coming year? Just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
It's a good question. I think a lot of them are very much focused around H2 certification, number one. So almost the quality of hydrogen in terms of its cleanness and the level of CO2 emissions within it is a huge topic that's being discussed at EU level. Of course, why this gets very interesting is when you start thinking about imports and exports, both to and from Canada, from Europe, where certain rules are being stipulated and being set in Europe could really set a precedence, especially if Europe moves first in terms of demand, not for Canada and of course for North America as a whole. So that's a huge topic of discussion. Another one is very much around blending. A lot of the pipelines that you see in Europe now are very much up in scope for repurposing, reuse, and one of the key enablers for that market is being seen as hydrogen blending, so putting 2%, 20% volume within those networks. Consultations have just been released in the UK. I highly recommend everyone has a read. It's a very well-written consultation, and some of the questions that are being asked are really challenging questions to answer around how the capacity market would work, around how you would protect certain industrial customers who can only handle a 2% blend while others can handle 20%. I think, again, the rules and the frameworks that are built out in Europe to manage blending could be very applicable for Canada and their networks as well. So yeah, blending and I would say H2 certification and emission levels within H2 production are the two big trends in my view. But yeah, Mark, David, you may have some further thoughts.
No, covered it well. There's a question in the chat from Cara. Interested to hear your thoughts about hydrogen build out in Ontario and Quebec. So it depends on who I'm talking to answer that question. But the drivers in these two regions are definitely different than Alberta. So a lot on the transportation side in Ontario at the moment, in places like Bruce, which is becoming a hydrogen hub around the Bruce Power Station. Transportation does seem to be the number one driver. You also have the 401 corridor, which is the busiest freight corridor in North America. It can really provide a lot of demand on that side. But really where we see the scale up and I would say economic sustainability of the ecosystem starting to develop is in places like Sarnia or Hamilton, where there could be really large amounts of demand for hydrogen in the future. So there's a couple of things that are impeding, let's say, like an area like Sarnia from becoming a hydrogen or clean hydrogen hub. And, chief among them, I would say, is the CO2 regulation at the moment. So you currently cannot store CO2 underground in Ontario, which is something that is being worked on and I think will be resolved soon enough. Still a lot of technical challenges and assumptions that need to be worked out. But once that happens, it could scale up blue hydrogen production and consumption also in Sarnia and the rest of Ontario. Quebec, I also think that there's a strong opportunity for hubs forming there. There's the Trois-Rivières region, which is super strong, like has a lot of the same elements as Alberta. When you think about workforce, manufacturing, hydrogen demand and production, there's the Air Liquide 20 megawatt electrolyzer. So happy I can talk about this for a while. So Kara, if you want to reach out to me, please do on LinkedIn and we can continue that discussion.
Great. Thank you, David. I'll take the question related to residential use of hydrogen, and then Imran, if you could take the question when we're done with that relative to the export market, because I think that's an excellent question as well. So from a Guidehouse perspective, our view on how the market develops is the lowest hanging fruit is current state use of hydrogen and decarbonizing that feedstock, right? That's where the industrial clusters become very important. That's how you create the broader at-scale ecosystem. That's where the market starts, right? And then you can start to think about other applications for the use of hydrogen. When it comes to downstream combustion of hydrogen, right? There it becomes more challenging when we think about helping clients fuel switch, where you also have to change out the combustion technology, right? So we think there's a lot of challenges associated with being cost competitive to fuel switch, right? But now if I also have to bring the capital and the structure to convert the combustion technology, it becomes much more challenging. We are involved in projects, especially in the EU, one called Hydrogen Village, a couple others, where they're looking at distribution systems, commercial and residential applications. From a technology point of view, it is doable, right? But what we've done is we've added another layer of cost, another layer of complexity. And so from our perspective, we think we may see that, but that will be much further along in that future state, right? If you go back to kind of David's example, how he walked you through the decades, right? The 2030s, the 2040s, the 2050s, it will be a while before we get to the point where we have an efficient economic distribution system on a commercial and residential basis. And Imran, feel free to jump in on the work that you've been involved in the EU.
No, I think you're spot on, Mark. So I think where we're at, taking the UK as a prime example, is a lot of the focus and funding has gone towards industrial clusters because there's a clear need and a very clear business case in the role of hydrogen in decarbonizing these elements. Hydrogen for heating is one area that is almost like the elephant in the room. Right now, the policy decision is not being made or even thought about in depth in terms of strategy until 2026. So you can see we're already funding industrial clusters and we're not even making policy decision yet for another good 3 years in the UK, which aligns exactly with Mark said. There is a natural almost merit order of where hydrogen is most likely to go first based on ease of usage and need. And right now, residential heating is another front of that list, I'm sure. Okay, let me quickly take the question by Jonathan, which is a great question as well. In short, so a quick context, so questions around role of hydrogen supply for export and whether that's a legitimate demand. My answer to that question is, in short, yes, absolutely. There are a lot of markets that have imbalances, and David can allude to some of the volumes because I know he's done a lot of work looking at that. So I'll pass over to him in a second. Now, your question on the technologies. This is a question we're wrestling with in Europe a lot. The role of derivatives like e-ammonia, e-methanol, etc., still needs to be found out, and I think they could play a significant role potentially in the transportation routes of getting hydrogen from out of areas like Canada into kind of key Asian markets, for example, and of course to Europe. I think for me, the bigger question that for sure needs to be answered is how do you get the hydrogen supply from inland Canada, for example, to key ports to then leave the country? I think that is just as big a challenging question as actually getting it out of Canada, is how you create that infrastructure to be able to do that. That's kind of my short views. David, I know you've done a lot of work in this area as well, whether you want to add to it a bit more.
Yeah, I mean, that is the biggest question, is how do you build a pipeline or a means of efficiently transporting a large quantity of hydrogen? You mentioned the numbers, not sure on the top of my head, but it's definitely in the tens of megatons range if you're talking about Japan, South Korea. And so obviously a huge opportunity, but well, I shouldn't say obviously, but most likely a huge opportunity. It's just that the domestic infrastructure requirements are massive. And speaking with Japanese colleagues and people that represent some of these industries, they're looking to Canada for supply of hydrogen. That's for sure. And it's going to be a competitive process that Australia is involved in, the U.S. is involved in, other places. If you look forward to a liquid market, you do see a role for Canada on the world stage as an exporter of hydrogen, but it's really reconciling that domestic roadblock and challenge on the midstream infrastructure side.
Great. Imran, we've got a brand new, again, lots of great questions. Keep them coming. We have got questions regarding fuel cells and the application in the UK. Is there anything that we have to share there? And then I can talk more broadly about hydrogen for generation in terms of market segment when you're done.
Yeah, no, it's a very, very good question. In short, I'm not 100% sure, being super transparent, but I know a lot of people, so I can absolutely get you something, Nafal, and send it across. Just building on it slightly, I still see huge uncertainty on what the strategy is going to be for homes in the UK. The reason why is because in the UK you have huge differences in housing stock in terms of levels of insulation, and as you know, seasonal weather changes in the UK as it is in Canada is huge. These are factors that are really driving differences on what can be electrified versus where electrification is just not an answer. And that's where you have roles for cogen, fuel cell generation, or just straight hydrogen into boilers. So no, very good question. I'll actually have a look at that and definitely send you something across if you just ping me a message on LinkedIn.
Great, thank you, Imran. That does open the door a little bit. We'll share with you our view from a Guidehouse perspective in terms of hydrogen as a fuel source for generation, stepping away from the fuel cell question specifically. But we have done a lot of analysis. As we talked about, we're involved in a number of the hubs. We've seen the economics behind power generation. There's recent rulemaking coming out of EPA potentially for certain gas-fired generation in the lower 48, where depending upon capacity factor, size, and age of the infrastructure, you may be making a selection between carbon capture and storage or hydrogen to decarbonize that generation fleet. It is very challenging to see a scenario from our perspective where firing on hydrogen in a gas-fired turbine is a base load operation, right? Having said that, in the markets where we've done deep analysis, gas-fired generation, either fueled with natural gas and carbon capture and storage or blended hydrogen, is essential to complementing the growth in renewables, right? You need it for a whole host of different reasons: energy system resilience, energy system reliability, integrity, backup. So there's all kinds of good reasons to do that, but it's very challenging to see it in a baseload mode. But we do see in later stages, after we convert existing hydrogen to lower carbon utilization, that generation is a market segment that should be adopting hydrogen.
So there's a question here from Raj. When I saw this question, I immediately thought, how many Europes can you fit in Canada? Because you're really talking about the difference between a large difference distance between a lot of the industrial demand and cities and population. So I looked this up, and to my surprise, they're about the same size, even not counting Russia. So yeah, it's like 98% similar. So that's not a great analogy, but in Canada, there really are these large, expansive areas of land like the prairies where it would be challenging to justify a business case for building a pipeline from there, from Alberta all the way to Ontario, let's say, or across the country. My personal view, and this is not Guidehouse view, Guidehouse will probably develop a view through the North American hydrogen backbone, so stay tuned for that. But is that it'll be more played out in clusters. And so there could be an Alberta hydrogen backbone that could connect up to British Columbia. There could be, once the regulations are resolved in Ontario, more likely that SMR is and blue hydrogen is built in Ontario, and you can continue to move gas from Alberta to Ontario and just produce it locally there. So that would forego the need for a hydrogen across the entire country. And as well, green hydrogen will play a role in a lot of these provinces where there's potential. So I hope that answers your question. In terms of the standards and regulations, that's definitely still an open question, and hopefully something that can be developed federally with some regional nuances for sure, but still more work to be done there for sure.
Well, let's talk on that. Good question from Daniel for a second, right? So what have we learned from the work in the EU, and what are we learning from the work in the lower 48? When and if at all possible, stay within existing energy corridors, right? The big premise, both with the European hydrogen backbone and a lot of what we're looking at with the North American hydrogen backbone, utilize existing rights of way and easements where there's already energy infrastructure, right? No matter what goals we're trying to achieve, how efficient and how effective the projects can be, if you want the support from environmental justice communities, if you want to provide more community benefits, if you want to get more support from external stakeholders, stay within the existing swim lanes, right? Key learnings, right? So minimize the, trying to build out infrastructure where there's not existing infrastructure. And, if you look carefully at the slides and the maps that Imran reviewed, you'll see that essentially the majority of the infrastructure proposed in the EU is within existing energy corridors. So great question, Daniel. Nicholas, I think we've hit the questions in the chat here. Back to you.
Thank you for that, Mark, Imran, and David. And I think just a quick question for you, Mark, and I'm just curious, as the this is obviously of high importance to HFCA and our advocacy efforts. What impact is the DOE Hydrogen Hub program expected to have, and what can you say? What Canada can learn from the process?
Yeah, so good question. So one of the things for folks that are not deeply involved in the DOE hydrogen hubs, while the grants are substantial, the economic benefits are substantial, the permanent balance sheet support you get from the federal government is critical to driving down the cost curves, and also getting the environmental credits through the IRA. At the end of the day, the amount of cash that comes from DOE, especially in the early stage project development, is rather small, right? So one of the key lessons we've learned both in the EU as well as in the US is that the equity sponsors of these projects are going to have to bear an inordinate amount of risk and development capital to move the projects to pre-feed, into feed, where then you're getting substantial support through the grants and some of these other mechanisms. So I think one of the shortcomings of these programs is you're not seeing enough cash for development capital in the near term. And so as you build out the ecosystems, as you have the participants in the projects weighing in, they need to be bringing significant development capital to the table. It's a higher risk. It merits a higher yield. But then as the ecosystem is de-risked, those players can be compensated accordingly.
All right, I think there's another quick question in the chat that I can try and pick up. So there's a piece around hydrogen supply chain problems. So I'll talk about it more broadly than just commercial vehicles. So answer to that is yes, for sure. I think there's naturally a supply chain challenge given where raw minerals are located and where key pieces of equipment are produced. How Europe are going. So that plus skills, I think this is one area that we actually haven't touched on here a lot. Workforce in terms of actual pipeline building knowledge is limited in Europe. The reason why is because we have a very mature network, and it's something that is a real challenge going forward, both skills and supply chain. How we're now looking to go overcome that challenge. is how do we start driving and stimulating new supply chains within Europe itself. Of course, this is where government support is going to be crucial and critical in making that happen. And from a skills perspective, one area that we are actually doing is looking at countries like Canada, and we actually we've come out on a number of projects to actually understand and learn about the pipeline capabilities that are and development capabilities that are actually happening in Canada. So I know we talk a lot about the negatives, but there are also some real pros and positives that are happening in North America and Canada that shouldn't be forgotten and should be leveraged where possible.
Thank you, Imran. We have another question from Nafal. What experiences can you share about efforts or technologies for combined systems, whether it be solar or wind and hydrogen or other combinations?
I can have a quick crack and then I'll pass over to marketing. So for combined solutions, what we've found in Europe, and I've actually seen this in North America as part of the US Hydrogen Hub, is all about driving capacity factors up to make it as cost effective as possible in procuring electricity for green hydrogen production. The cost of electricity is a huge driver of the cost effectiveness and competitiveness of a lot of these projects. So now what you're starting to see is solar, wind and batteries, a mix of potentially grid and solar to help balance and create that right procurement strategy for electricity production that really drives the cheapest possible hydrogen production cost, which of course is what's going to really stabilize and drive this market. So we are seeing it a lot in Europe, and I know a lot of that conversation is happening in the US and North America as well. But yeah, David, Mark, feel free to add more on that.
Yeah, I don't want to go too far down the policy hole here since we only have a minute or so left, but keep your eye on two key policies as they unfold in the EU. They are additionality and temporal correlation. It's part of the answer to the question about the integration between renewable power generation and the ability to make green hydrogen. As you get more granular with additionality issues and especially temporal correlation, there are challenges that we need to figure out and overcome. We are believers at Guidehouse that the essence of those policies are also likely to find their way into North America, right? Because they're not illogical. You have many of the same players, both internal and external stakeholders, asking the exact same questions. So keep your eye on additionality, temporal correlation. The third leg of that school is geographic correlation. But those are very, very important to answering the very good and last question we have in the chat there, Nicholas.
Thank you, Mark, Imran, and David. That brings us to the end of our webinar today. As I mentioned previously, folks, please do reach out to the CHFCA directly via email if you have any further questions for the team here at Guidehouse, and we'll be sure to connect with all of you. We'll be sure to connect you with Imran and David and Mark. To our members, we will be circulating the recording and the slides for this session once approved from our friends here at Guidehouse. So on behalf of the teams here at CHFCA and Guidehouse, we would like to thank you for attending our webinar today. We look forward to hosting you the next one. Thank you very much to our presenters as well.
Thank you, Nicholas. Thanks to my colleagues, everyone, for attending.
Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Good one.
Bye.